How's everybody doing today? Good? Good? Let's try that again. I think we got off on a little bit of a weird start right there. How's everybody doing today? Oh, it's so good to be with you. I'm excited to be kicking off a new series this morning we're calling Battle. And, we plan some of these things out months ahead. And a couple weeks ago, we were preparing and having conversations about the start of this new series, and we were going to call it Armor Up. And quite honestly, given the events that surrounded January 6th and some of the other things that have happened in our country, we wanted to be mindful of some of the realities of what it sounds like we're communicating. And so we changed the name of the series to Battle. We're going to talk about the things that we battle. But at the core, no matter what we call the series, I want you to hear how what we talk about impacts your life and how it shapes the issues that we deal with and address in our world today. Here's what we know. It's something that all of us will hold in common. We all battle things in our lives. And of course, those battles, the things that we do battle, it looks different for all of us. Some of them are small issues, some of them are significant issues. And of course, in our lives on any given season, we can deal with small issues and we can deal with some of these big issues. But how do we navigate them? How do we address the battles that wage within each and every one of us? And just to kind of help us get on the same page, I want to talk about maybe some of the more common battles that we might deal with. One is laziness. As people, we battle with laziness. We have to make choices every day. Will I get up? Will I go to work? Will I go to school? Will I do the things that I'm supposed to be doing today? Or will I allow the battle to win? Will I choose laziness? Will I stay in bed? Or will I binge watch one more episode of The Queen's Gambit? Anybody? Not me, I haven't actually watched an episode. My wife's watched them all. It's not just laziness though, right? There's other battles that are going on. We choose battles there's a battle that wages over our physical health. Are we going to prioritize and make a point to eat healthy and to work out? Or will we choose to have that slice of dessert or that next slice of pizza? And honestly, I'm always the person that has one more slice of pizza. But that's a battle, that's happening inside of us. There is battles for our mental health. Will we choose to do the things that we know we need to do to maintain just a positive state, be in good mental health from a perspective of how we're functioning and living within this world? Or will we allow anxiety to overcome us, depression to overcome us, stress, fear? How do we navigate the battle for our mental health? We battle for our relationships. Will we prioritize and make time to date our spouse? Or will we continually choose to leverage our time as a focus on my wants and my needs or our time for someone else? We battle in our relationships. We also battle addictions for some of us. Will I do the things that I need to do to continue down this road towards recovery? Or will I give into this temptation? Will I give into this call that I experience in my life to go pursue these things? How do we address and deal with that battle? Each and every day, for each of us, there are battles that we are experiencing. And the truth is, when we don't battle these things, when we don't choose to wage into the issue, the choices we make determine the outcome. The choices we make or do not make determines whether our lives get better or they get worse. If we choose not to battle, we can become lazy. If we choose not to battle, we can get out of shape. If we choose not to battle, our relationships could get hurt. Our addictions can run off the rails. If we don't choose to battle, our anxiety runs rampant. Our lives become about me. And I know that all of us have experienced this in something. Maybe I didn't even address a battle that you're dealing with today, but we all have these experiences in life where there's something that is happening in us. And I think one of the key reasons why we don't engage in the battle that we're experiencing is because as a culture, we've sort of been taught to be conflict avoidant. Let's avoid the conflict. Let's avoid the battle because it makes us feel better inside. And so we'll do whatever we can, whether it's an external conflict or it's an internal conflict. We'll try to avoid the issue because in some ways we're scared to address it because of the relational pain or conflict it can cause in us or with someone else. And what I want us to understand as we kick off this series this weekend is these battles they're not bad. Waging into the battle is not a bad thing. And the truth is, the battles that we experience, they can be won, but we must. This is so important. We must truly understand what it is that we're fighting against. You see, I think one of the reasons why we don't overcome our struggles, why we don't win these battles, is because we often misdiagnose the problem. Like we think it's something else. Like my relationships would be better if my spouse would just, you can fill in the blank. We think, well, if I can just fix him or fix her, then this battle would be over. Or if it's my kids, maybe if I could just fix my kids. If I could fix my kids, then I wouldn't have this battle going on anymore. You guys ever experienced that? You fix your kids. If your kids are sitting next to you right now, you're like, I'm not going to raise my hand. But here's the thing. Yes, we can relate to that, right? If I just fix my kids, then this battle will subside. Or maybe it's like, well, the root of the problem is my work, it's my weight, it's my health, it's my addiction, it's my anxiety, whatever it is. We think, I'll focus on those. I'll focus on that problem. If I deal with that problem, then everything else will be fine. But the reality is, most of the things that we focus on, most of the things that we choose to address when it comes to the battle that we're experiencing inside of us are not actually the problem. We misdiagnose the problem. So then we have to ask ourselves, well, what is it that we're battling? If it's not an addiction, if it's not a relationship, if it's not our kids, if it's not our workplace, if it's not our physical or mental health, what is the actual battle that we have to deal with? And this is what I want you to understand. The root of every single battle that we experience in our lives is spiritual. That the root of every single battle that we experience in our lives is spiritual. Now, maybe you're not a Christ follower, and maybe you're just hanging out with us this weekend, maybe you're engaging online, you're like, I don't agree with that, because I don't even believe in spiritual things. How could everything be a spiritual problem? And we're going to talk about that, but here's the other reality. For some of us who've been walking with Christ for a long season in our lives, we might mentally understand that we're facing a spiritual battle, but we don't fight that battle in the means or the manner that God tells us to. We might understand it's spiritual, but we address it as if it's relational. We address it like if the problem is an earthly problem instead of a spiritual problem. So I want to take some time to talk about that. But to talk about it, I want to make sure we can kind of agree on some basic premises to make sure we're kind of tracking along with agreement with one another. So the first premise is this, that in our world, there is light and there is darkness. Right? There's two things. There's light and there's darkness. When you walk into a room and you turn on the switch, what happens? There's light, right? Okay, we're good. We're on the same page here. You walk out of the room, you turn off the switch, darkness. Or every single day, the sun rises. When the sun rises, what happens to the earth? It's filled with light. And at sunset, darkness. That in our world, there is a basic premise of light and darkness. The two exist, and we can agree upon that. Here's another one. That in our world, there is good and there is evil. And the basic assumption, at least the cultural assumption, is that people inherently are good. That as people, like, we are inherently good. And this is kind of, this belief has been perpetuated by the 18th century philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And Rousseau believed at the core of every human being was the potential for good. And that he believed that given the right circumstances, the right family unit, the right resources, the right education, that person would choose good. But if that person didn't choose what was good, if that person chose evil over what is good, well, it's a byproduct of their experience. It's a byproduct of their structure, their family unit, their upbringing. Because inherently, if a person is evil, it's because they have been wounded. They have been hurt. And I'm sure you've heard this phrase before, hurt people hurt people. In a nutshell, Rousseau believed that we are good until the world makes us evil. And as Christians, we might view that a little bit differently, but most people Most people can generally get on the same page with the assumption that in our world there is good and there is evil. And our cultural understanding is, again, people are good until culture makes them evil because of some woundedness or because of some hurt. But here's the problem, and here's what every single one of us know who have kids, that that's actually not true. That's not how we are put into this world. Like, I have kids. My kids now are 11 and 8 years old, and so they're quite a bit older than being a young child. But I remember when they were 2 to 3 years old. Do you remember your kids at 2 to 3 years old? They would do the sweetest, kindest, cutest things that you've ever seen in your life. But there are other times where they would literally act like the devil. Right? And you're like, I don't know what happened to you. Like a second ago, I wanted to like squeeze you and hug you and hold you and kiss you forever. And like right now, I just want you to go somewhere else. Now here's the thing. We don't teach our kids to do those things. We don't teach them how to be deceitful. We don't teach them how to be selfish. Like we don't teach them some of these traits that we don't like. It's in them. It's a part of who they are. It's not because the world has shaped them. It's not because they have been wounded or have been parented by hurt people. Sometimes that's part of their reality. But what we know as parents is that innate in us is this, seems weird to say, but evil streak. It seems weird to say because it's in reference to our kids, but we also know that it's true of us. But just look at your own life for a second. Like, how often in your life do you prioritize your time and your schedule around you? How much of your life revolves around your own selfishness, your own deceit, your lies, your gossip, your fill in the blank? Like, whatever that blank is for you. How much of your life is about those things? And the reason why we do that is because there is an issue. There is a spiritual issue that is a part of all of our lives. The battles that we experience in our lives are spiritual at their very core. And because of that, there's a battle for our hearts, there's a battle for our minds, there's a battle for our souls. There is a battle that is being waged for our lives. And that's what we're going to talk about. We're going to try to get to the root of this battle. And over the course of this series, talk about how we can be strong and stand firm in the midst of the battles that we are facing. This morning, we're going to look at words from the Apostle Paul, words that he wrote in a letter to the church in Rome. And some of these words, it clues us into this reality, this spiritual battle reality that we've been talking about. And as we read these words, I want you to understand, like, Paul is sharing with the church his own experience. Like, firsthand, he has dealt with this reality. This is what we read beginning in Romans chapter 7 and verse 18. Paul says, "For I know that good itself does not dwell in me. That is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out." You ever feel that way? You ever feel like we want to do what's good, we have the desire to do what's good, but seemingly no matter how hard we try, we can't actually carry out and do the things that we want to do? Like, as people, we have this vision of a better self that we want to achieve. That very desire gave rise to what is known as the self-help industry. Now, there's some debate about when this industry started, but most people say in the late 80s and the early 90s, with the advent of home shopping, really saw the boom of this self-help industry, where people were really interested in, how do I make myself better? How do I stop this? I want to do good, so I will focus on myself. I will read books. I will watch shows. I will buy this whatever thing. There's all sorts of them. Guys, remember the shake weight? Right? No, okay. A couple of us do because we spent $39.95 on it or whatever it was. But we invest in these things, right? We're going to make ourselves better. And this industry, over a 20-year period, it grew like crazy. It actually peaked in 2007. And in 2007, it was a $10 billion industry. $10 billion a year were invested in self-help. But here's the thing. Since 2007, it has steadily declined because the reality is people are realizing it's not about discipline. It's not about willpower. There's something else that's going on. We can't just try harder or focus more or be better. Like, we have to address this issue differently. Because again, it's not a physical reality problem. It is a spiritual problem. And so Paul continues. He clues us in again to this bigger issue. Verse 19 and 20. Paul says, "For I do not do the good that I want to do, but the evil I do not want to do, this I keep doing. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but it is what? It is sin. It is sin living in me that does it." Now, I understand this probably sounds like a horrible reality of chasing after something that you seemingly will never actually obtain. But the reason why we can't obtain that, the reason why no amount of self-help will help us become the person that we want to be, is because there is an issue that is waging. There's a battle inside of us that is beyond our control. And Paul tells us what that battle is. That battle is sin at work in us. It is a spiritual battle. And if we're going to fight a spiritual battle, then the truth is we have to fight it in the ways that God has told us how to fight it. And that's what we're going to talk about. Over the next 4 weeks, we're going to look specifically at a passage of Scripture that comes from the book of Ephesians. It's a letter that Paul wrote to the church in Ephesus, and it's known, if you've been around church, you've probably heard this before, it's known as the armor of God. And I want to read it to you just so we're all kind of starting at the same point here. Paul writes these words in Ephesians 6, beginning in verse 10. He says, "Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Therefore, put on the full armor of God, so that when the day of evil comes, you may be able to stand your ground. And after you have done everything to stand, stand firm then, with the belt of truth buckled around your waist, with the breastplate of righteousness in place, and with your feet fitted with the readiness that comes from the gospel of peace. In addition to all this," Paul says, "take up the shield of faith, with which you can extinguish all flaming arrows of the evil one. Take the helmet of salvation and the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God." And so over the course of this series, we're going to talk about each of these issues. We're going to break down some of these individual elements of the armor of God to understand how we can leverage them in our lives to fight the battle that is happening in us and around us. That's what we're going to talk about over the next 3 weeks. But what I want us to talk about for the rest of our time together this morning is found in verse 11 and verse 12. We're just going to go back. We're just going to read that one more time together. Verse 11 and verse 12 of Ephesians 6. Paul says, "Put on the full armor of God, so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." Paul points us directly to the target. Paul points us to who the real enemy is. He also informs us in how the enemy operates. Paul says the battles that we experience in our lives are the result of the devil's schemes, his misconceptions, and his lies. It's the devil. It is Satan. He is the one that we battle. This is not a battle against flesh and blood, which is important to know, because understanding who we're fighting against helps us to prepare for how we fight. So we're going to talk a lot about that. But we need to talk about Satan for just a few minutes. Because we need to really understand who our enemy is. And I don't mean understand or know him like we know his name. Because there's a lot of different names that are used in Scripture for Satan. We need to talk about how Satan operates. how he tries to infiltrate, how he works through deception and lies. If we want to overcome the battles, we need to fully understand our enemy. And you'll notice as we read through Ephesians 6, there is one word that keeps popping up again and again. Paul continually says, take a stand, stand firm. 4 times in just a few verses, we see that word again and again. So how do we take a stand against Satan? For one, we need to understand where the battle's coming from. But the second part is what we're going to talk about. We need to understand who our enemy is. And for some of us, that's going to make us uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable, like, to talk about Satan, and we just sometimes to prefer he doesn't exist. But the reality is, for us to ignore Satan is to allow him to run unchecked in our lives. There's a pastor and a theologian named John Stott, and he would once say these words: to deny Satan's reality is to expose ourselves to his subtlety. Now, that word subtlety, it's an old English way of saying his subtlety. To deny Satan's reality is to allow him to continue to work and function in our lives, in our world, in very subtle ways. And I love that quote because I think it so accurately describes how Satan operates. That he's crafty, that he works behind the scenes, that he works in ways that we don't immediately know or can target and point to, saying, hey, that's Satan. This is his problem. Now, the Bible tells us a lot about Satan. We see Satan at the very beginning. In the Garden of Eden, we see Satan, the serpent, in the garden with Adam and Eve, and he tempts Adam and Eve to eat from the tree of the knowledge of what? Good and evil. See where this comes back? Basic premises, good and evil. So Satan tempts Adam and Eve to eat from this tree. We know that they do. They choose to eat from the tree. Sin enters the world. His deception, his craftiness changed the trajectory of humankind. But that's not where it ends. In the Old Testament, we also see that Satan tempts Job. He comes to Job and he tempts him to give up his allegiance on God through a season of difficult trials. In the New Testament, we're told that Satan goes to Jesus in the desert or in the wilderness as he's there for 40 days and tempts him to turn his back on God. Later in the Gospels, we're told that Satan enters Judas and convinces Judas to betray Jesus. Satan's presence is littered throughout the pages of Scripture. And each time we read about him, every time we read about Satan, it's the same basic premise. The issues are one of deception and of lies. That's who Satan is. He's trying to deceive us, and he will lie to us to perpetuate his deception. And we see that New Testament church leaders are constantly trying to combat this issue. Matter of fact, Paul, the Apostle Paul, we've talked about him briefly, Paul writes a letter to the church in Corinth. And one of the issues that the church is dealing with is there are some false prophets who are corrupting the church with some of their teachings. They are using their eloquent words or their stature to deceive people into doing things that are counter to the gospel message that Paul and his companions preach to this church. And so Paul calls it out, but when he calls it out, he illuminates for us some of the ways that Satan works. This is what Paul says in 2 Corinthians in chapter 11. He says, and no wonder, speaking of these false prophets, no wonder they act like that. No wonder they deceive others. No wonder they continue to do what they do. For Satan himself masquerades as an angel of light. Every time light is used in the Bible, it is synonymous with good. When light enters, when the light of the world comes into the world, goodness, life, enters the world. And so I think it's so fitting that Paul uses this term here, the angel of light, because that's the deception. That's what Satan does. He wants us to think that he is good and that someone else or something else is the problem, that someone else or something else is the root of the battle that we are experiencing. And what I need us to understand as we walk through this series together is we need to reject that lie. We need to completely reject that lie because, again, this is Satan's deception. It's not actual reality. That Satan or his forces want us to believe that our enemy is actually people when our enemy is Satan. I want to say that again because I think it's so important, not just for today, but in our culture today. Satan wants us to believe that our enemies are other people. But the reality is our enemy is Satan himself. And if we could see through that deception, if we can see through that lie, then we would be better equipped to engage in the actual spiritual battle that's happening in front of us. That's the truth. The issue is Satan. It's not someone or something else. And here's what I believe. No one else in culture, no one else in our world outside of the church is going to tell you what the real battle is, who the real enemy is. Nowhere else is going to help you understand that. You know, you turn on the news, and there is a lot of news networks you can turn on these days. You can turn on CNN, you can turn on Fox News, you can turn on MSNBC, and guess what? None of them are going to say, hey, breaking report, Satan is the enemy. Like, it's not going to happen. It's not going to happen. They're going to tell you, look, hey, this other person, this other party, this other belief is the actual enemy instead of Satan. That's what's going to happen. We're not going to see that when we turn on the news. Or maybe we don't watch news. I don't have cable television, so I don't watch a lot of news. But I go to social media. And we go to social media and we scroll through our social media feeds. What we find is biased information. Matter of fact, social media networks are built on the concept, their algorithms are built on the concept of confirmation bias. They prioritize and give us all information that resonates with our basic biases, like how we believe, how we perceive the world. They just feed us more information. So what's on your social media feed might be different than what's on my social media feed, or might be different than what's on this person's social media feed. I'm gonna be honest, on my feed, it's a lot of Dodgers, a lot of Rams, a lot of puppies, and a lot of skiing, okay? But because of confirmation bias, we receive what we already believe, and so it perpetuates this belief in us that someone else or something else is the actual problem. Because again, our media, our culture, our tech companies, they're not going to be straight with you. The issue is a spiritual issue. The issue, the person, the being that we're battling is Satan. And we cannot forget that. In the face of this reality, Peter wrote words a long time ago that are as pertinent as ever in our world today. Look what Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. He says, be alert, and of sober mind. It's got me thinking about that word sober. And often, what we do is we consume substances that distort our views, right? We drink alcohol. We get a little intoxicated. We see the world differently. And I can't help but think some of this sober-minded is what are we feeding our minds with? What are we watching? What are we listening to? What are we scrolling through? Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, your enemy, Satan, prowls around like a roaring lion, looking for someone to devour. Peter says, be alert, be watchful, because Satan is on the prowl and he's looking for someone to devour. Like, Peter is not mincing his words right here. That Satan is looking for someone to devour. Guys, do you know how Satan devours us? By convincing us to devour one another. Satan convinces us to devour one another. And that's not of God. And the reality is, if you're sitting here this morning and your heart is filled with more hate than love for other people, love for God, love for his creation, then Satan is winning the battle for your heart. But he doesn't have to win the war. Because the truth is, God has given us the tools to fight this spiritual battle. And with God's strength and his leading in our lives, we can fight back. And we do it honestly by putting on the full armor of God. And we can't wait over the next 3 weeks to talk to you about what some of those pieces are and how they can equip you to be the warrior that God has made you to be. The ways that they can equip you to take a stand against the crafty, deceptive schemes of Satan. Let's pray.